I know I might be the only one, but I don't think this whole NBA All-Star weekend was a total bust. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend the trash dunk contest or the lackluster All-Star game, but the people who are chalking this whole weekend up as a total failure and say that we should just get rid of it are plain wrong. In fact, I had a much different takeaway because I think that the three-point competition between Steph and Sabrina actually gave us a really interesting insight into the future of the sport of basketball. Now, stick with me here because I'm aware you might not have gotten that impression if you watched and listened to the commentary live or if you followed anything that came out after the fact. I mean, we literally had Kenny Smith, who is a broadcaster, rip Sabrina live after she narrowly lost to one of the greatest shooters of all time. After losing by just 3 points, Kenny Smith said live on the air that she should have shot it from the women's line. And if you don't recall, Sabrina was going to shoot from the WNBA line, which is about 21 inches in front of the NBA line, and decided to move back to the NBA line for this competition. But instead of praising this move as something that I think many would consider to be admirable as a way to level the playing field, Kenny Smith said that she should have shot from the women's line to make it more of a fair contest. And then Reggie Miller went on to make some joke about how she should be playing with dolls. Apparently this was a callback to something Sabrina said in an interview earlier, but it just came off as really insensitive and tone deaf. And as you can see here, I was not the only one who noticed the ridiculousness of this commentary. And as a general point, I really hate when commentators talk about the scope of the thing as it's happening instead of just commentating on the thing that's going on. Like, they could have talked about how great it was that the fans were lively and given us a look into the arena, or talk about what great competition and gamesmanship were going on between two really talented people at their own craft. But instead, Kenny Smith and Reggie Miller and all the guys on the broadcast had to make it about themselves, talking about the moment as if it wasn't something that we were all already aware of. And this happens on both sides of this argument, by the way, especially as it pertains to basketball. You have the Kenny Smiths of the world talking and discrediting Sabrina's performance, saying that she needed some sort of handicap to compete, which clearly she did not. And then on the other side, you have these WNBA fans who, it's a whole nother video, but WNBA fans that seem to be fans of the Women's National Basketball Association just because it says something about them and not because they're actually fans of the game that's going on. And so there's this sort of broader commentary to their fandom that is in no way related to the actual game. It's very frustrating, but that's not even what I'm here to talk about. Because trying to zoom out and talk about all the interdynamics between the NBA and the WNBA and women and men as basketball players misses the complete context of what this competition was. And I think there's actually some interesting nuance that you could talk about in this competition that everybody seemed to miss because they just wanted to run to their corners of men are better than women or women deserve blah, blah, blah. And I think it all completely misses the point. So what they did not talk about on the broadcast, and I didn't see a lot of commentary about this before or after, is that both people, Steph and Sabrina, had a lot to lose in this competition. For starters, Steph risked losing to a WNBA player who many of his NBA colleagues, and I would assume most NBA fans, assume to be inferior to him as an NBA player, which would have almost certainly jeopardized his legacy as one of the greatest shooters of all time. And then on the other side, you have Sabrina, who arguably had more to lose, or at the very least, a lot less to gain, because for starters, a bad performance just solidifies this negative perception people have of the WNBA as a talentless organization. But even a good performance comes with this litany of qualifiers like, oh, she shot closer to the hoop from the WNBA line, or she's using some sort of different ball. So even her performing well doesn't say a lot about her because there are all these different qualifiers people try to attach to explain why she would have done well. And like I said earlier, she even tried to neutralize some of these qualifiers by voluntarily moving back and shooting from the same three-point line. But then you just have the brain dead argument that Kenny Smith provides, which is, well, she shouldn't have done that in the first place. She was literally in a lose-lose situation regardless of how she performed. And that's not even mentioning how she performed, because when you actually watch the thing, I think this went about as well as the NBA and the WNBA and Steph and Sabrina could have hoped, because you had Steph, who solidifies himself or just further cements himself as the greatest shooter of all time. He doesn't lose in what many probably would have assumed to be an embarrassing fashion to a WNBA player. And then you have Sabrina, who went out and she put the pressure on Steph. I mean, she had 26 points. Her score would have landed herself in the NBA three-point competition finals. And so she didn't put up any schlub of a performance either. And Steph had to put on what was, by all accounts, an above average to great three-point competition performance to even beat her. And so there was this mutual respect that was happening that I think ended up being really good for everyone involved. And I think that genuine excitement and intrigue was obviously reflected in the viewership. The NBA proudly put out the next day that audience peaked at 5.4 million viewers from 10 to 10:15 p.m., which was the time when Steph and Sabrina were competing. And the rest of the dumb dunk contest, three-point contest, skills challenge, they had minuscule viewership numbers as compared to this. In fact, the actual All-Star game, which happened the following day on Sunday, only recorded 5.5 million viewers. So this one 15-minute segment and all of the genuine intrigue and interest around it actually recorded far better numbers, relatively speaking, to the full All-Star game that the whole weekend is based around. But even with all of this said, the three-point contest went about as well as it should. I thought both competitors were gracious. They were competitive with each other. They were respectful. There was genuine intrigue in the All-Star game, which is something that you could not say for nearly any other facet of the entire weekend. And you still have people finding a way to, one, shit on it, or two, double down on their really shitty takes. And I present to you the poster boy of doubling down on his really shitty takes, Kenny Smith. So remember, he said that Sabrina should have moved up from the three-point line. Then he goes on Stephen A 2 days later and claims this.
Most people who know basketball understood what I was talking about. Actually, I was advocating for her more than anything else.
So Kenny Smith claims to be advocating for Sabrina, saying that she should have handicapped herself by moving forward to shoot from the WNBA three-point line, whereas you could see him very easily making the argument, and I don't want to put words into Kenny's mouth, but there were plenty of people who were also making the argument before she announced that she was going to move back to the NBA line that, oh, the only reason this is going to be competitive, or the only reason she's going to win, is because she gets to shoot 21 inches closer to the basket. So again, it comes back to this absolute no-win situation. And interestingly enough, this isn't the first time this has happened. This whole battle of the sexes idea is actually not a new idea. It's one that's almost half a century old, and it was first popularized when star women tennis player Billie Jean King, #1 in the world at the time, this is all the way back in 1973, was challenged by a 55-year-old Bobby Riggins. And he was the former #1 men's tennis player who had retired 18 years prior, was now 55 years old, living out his retired life. And he claimed that he could beat, at his ripe age of 55, any women's tennis player in the world. And so he called out Billie Jean King, who was at the time the best women's tennis player in the world, and challenged her to a match. And in what was dubbed the Battle of the Sexes, this was a really highly anticipated match, even more so than the 5.4 million people that watched Sabrina and Steph shoot. It was actually reported that there was something like 90 million people worldwide who were watching, and there was a prize purse of $100,000, which is almost $700,000 in today's money. And there were 30,000 people who gathered in the Houston Astrodome to watch this. So it was a really big deal. And there was a lot of pomp and circumstance around this in a way that is different than Steph and Sabrina, and I think it was worse. So you had this air of like men versus women. Obviously the Battle of the Sexes indicates as such, but this Bobby Riggins character was a self-described male chauvinist. I mean, he was one of these guys who was like, men are superior to women in every way, and not only that, women should never get things that are equal to men in sports specifically. And so while women tennis players at the time, Billie Jean King being one of them, were advocating for equal or closer to equal prize money at the same tennis tournaments, you know, these opens across the world, Bobby Riggs was basically saying, no, that shouldn't happen. Women are so inferior. Hey, look, I'm going to prove it as a guy way out of my prime, beating the #1 tennis player in the world.
A 55-year-old guy, if he'll stay on his vitamin pill program, take those 415 vitamins every day, and jog and train and keep his tennis up, why, you can last and beat those girls forever, see?
Bobby. Things went so far, in fact, that Billie Jean King actually bought Bobby Riggs a literal pig to represent his male pig chauvinistness, and she actually beat him in 3 straight sets. She won 6-4, 6-3, 6-3, solidifying that she was in fact the #1 tennis player in the world. And it was actually seen at the time, as crazy as it seems with all the ridiculousness that went on around the event, it was seen as a big milestone event for women in sports. You have one writer talk about how women like her literally screamed in delight in their living rooms because they felt vindicated as female athletes, but also feminists. You have to consider this is a very different time in the world. And so the idea that a woman could beat a man, do it on national TV, and be so celebrated for it, was a really big deal. But what do you see immediately after? Well, there are all these attempts to discredit what Billie Jean King does. There are commentators and sports fans that made excuses how Riggs could have gotten to these shots if he was younger or if he was in better shape. And there was even a story or some allegations that were thrown around that Riggs had deliberately lost the match because he owed money to the mob or something. So he bet a bunch of money against himself on the match, and so he could pay off something like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in gambling debts that he owed people. All attempts to discredit what Billie Jean King had done, which was backed up her claim that she could beat a male tennis player. And I go on that diatribe not to say that things are just like they were in the 1970s. In fact, they are notably a lot better specifically for female athletes. And you see this across every sport. I mean, we have like record-breaking numbers happening in women's soccer and women's basketball and college, like even at the collegiate level. And there's now a women's hockey league and there's women's volleyball leagues, and they're all doing pretty well from attendance numbers and from revenue numbers and from viewership numbers. And so things have changed and things have gotten better. And when you have competitions like these, no longer is a commentary or a majority of the commentary centered around like, are men as good as women, or do women deserve to make as much money as men? Like we've shedded those conversations and we've left them in years past. And now when we have something like this between Steph and Sabrina, we can just talk about how great each of them are at their own craft. And we can talk about how great of a shooter Steph is and how great of a performance Sabrina put up and how Steph had to overcome the great performance that he was faced with. And like, we can actually just dissect the play that's happening on the court and leave all of these notions of like tribalism and politics aside, because we understand as a society we've progressed further than that. And not that Steph would ever do this, but he wasn't lobbing sexist attacks and trying to take down Sabrina because she was a woman. He was genuinely treating her like the fearsome competitor she was, and he put on a equally genuine and legendary performance to beat her because that's what it took. But still, you have people like Kenny Smith, or a million people in my TikTok comments, trust me, just go watch the video, who are trying to drag this conversation back 50 years and talk about the validity of women in sports and debating the idea of whether or not they should earn enough money or earn as much money as men. Like, these are conversations that I thought we had settled 50 years ago. And I've been thinking a lot about why these conversations are even happening. Why, if it feels like that we settled this idea that women can play sports at the same level or sometimes a better level than men, why we keep dragging ourselves back into these conversations. And this isn't going to be one of these like get on my soapbox and lecture you about gender equality thing for the next 5 minutes. It's going to be talking about these leagues have gotten so big. The NFL, the NBA, the NHL, the MLB, I mean, MLS, like these professional sports leagues that are dominated by men have gotten so big and they have saturated the market so well that it's almost like there are no more fans left to conquer. Or at the very least, these brands and these leagues are not able to grow as fast as they once were. And that's obviously a problem for them, right? These commissioners, Adam Silver, Roger Goodell, have to show to their owners that they're growing just as fast as they were 10 years ago because that has become the expectation. But that's not really feasible anymore because you just kind of assume that every guy in the country who's going to be a basketball fan or who's going to be a football fan is kind of already a fan of a team or of the league. And so they're going to have to go other places to find fans. And so you see all these leagues go internationally, but domestically, where can they look to find new fans? And it's almost like when they can't do that, when they can't find a way to find new fans, there's a death rattle that happens. The leagues start to not decline, but stagnate in a way that's not really healthy. And I think the NBA is like the perfect example of this because in order to keep their current fan base happy, they have to keep innovating as to not be stale. But when they innovate on the same old thing, you end up with the All-Star game and like the most brain dead competitions that are just not in any way entertaining or what they were originally intended to be. And then you get to this weird circular logic where all of a sudden the thing that the current fans want is for the thing that they used to not want and was being iterated away from. And so it's like the new iteration happens, the fans hate it, then they want the old thing, and then they get bored of the old thing. And so it's like this weird circular logic. But I think the NBA just showed us how a league like themselves could get out of the circular logic by just introducing new fans to the game in a new way with this 3-point contest between Steph and Sabrina. So we don't have to come up with this crazy new dunk contest format or all-star game format. We can just do the same thing we were doing and do it for a new audience with new participants. And I think that's a really interesting concept because the NBA right now has a dominant male fan base. I mean, like 66% of men said that they're either avid or casual fans of the NBA. Meanwhile, you only have 10% of females who are avid fans, and then just another 28% who are even casual fans of the NBA. So by bringing in new audiences, you have the ability to just do the same thing you were always doing, but have new spice because new people are watching it, and also because you can bring in new participants like women playing from the WNBA. And I will caveat this next point by saying, obviously I'm a guy and I've always been represented in sports. Like I can always see somebody who looks like me playing in sports. So I don't really know what it's like for a woman to watch a professional sports league like the NBA and just not see somebody that looks like them. But we all know that guy that went to our high school that like went on to play college basketball, like D1 college basketball, or maybe got drafted and was an undrafted rookie in the NFL or something. And you saw a bit of yourself in that guy, and like you cheered for that team irrationally, or you cheered for that random practice squad player because he was a guy that was from where you were from, and you could see a bit of yourself in him. And I imagine it's the same effect when Sabrina's out there shooting threes against Steph, someone who even she has admitted was like a huge hero for her growing up. And will current NBA fans probably hate the fact that women are being brought into the game more and more, whether it's with Sabrina facing Steph or women even becoming fans of the game? Like, yes, I'm sure that is the case because we saw that play out with the NFL this year. But I think what I'm getting at is that it's a necessity for the NBA or for any league to do something like this, because without bringing fresh blood to your league, whether it be people participating or people rooting for it, you're just going to find yourself in this cycle of trying to reiterate on the same formats, and those reiterations oftentimes, like most of the time, just being super, super dumb. And you just are trapped with trying to please your current fan base, who will never be pleased because they've seen it all from you. And so bringing in fresh blood is like the way to not only preserve your brand, but to grow the game, which is what I assume the goal is for any sports league, specifically the NBA, who's now made a concerted effort to float the WNBA, to grow the game internationally. Like, they want to grow the game of basketball, and it seems like bringing women into the fold is going to be their way to do that. And I'm obviously not even making this point as like a make-a-wish, we need to give women a chance because they haven't had a chance. Like, Sabrina went toe-to-toe with Steph Curry in a three-point shooting contest. Clearly, these women are talented enough to hold their own in these sorts of competitions. And so we don't have to have this conversation anymore about like trying to discredit why they can or can't do it, or should or shouldn't do it. We should just all understand that they can do it. And including them in these all-star games going forward, or general league marketing going forward, is going to be a good thing for the game of basketball. And it's going to grow the brand of the NBA. It's going to grow the game everywhere. And if people don't like that, it should, like, I just don't think they like basketball. And that's probably what it comes down to. They want to hold basketball close to their heart. They want it to be like the way it's always been for them. And when it changes, they don't like that. And that's just what it is. So sorry to be on my high horse. Sorry to get on a bit of a soapbox, but I think it was necessary to talk about. Like, I was just, like, when Kenny Smith said that on live TV, I was just like scratching my head. Like, how do you say something so tone deaf? And it seems like he recognized what he was saying as he was saying it, and there's just no good way to say it. And the reason for that is because it just doesn't need to be said. Like, those conversations don't need to be had anymore. Let's just talk about the play that's happening on the court. I'll see you guys next week with another one of these videos. Hopefully salacious and interesting things keep happening, because it makes for easy video topics. Check out my video last week about the Green Bay Packers mascot. That was a fun one.